Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Through a Black Lens. I'm Liz Quirantes. Thanks for joining us. Now, in this series, our goal is not to find answers to the questions about the role that race plays in our society, but rather to offer some perspective. For those of us who are not African American, it can be difficult to approach the concerns of that community in a meaningful way. So it's the goal of these discussions to lead to a better understanding of the Black experience in our culture and in our homes here in Palm Beach County, in Okeechobee County, and on the Treasure Coast. Now, to lead us in these discussions, I'd like to introduce Mr. Richard Ryles, a local attorney and historian who actually came up for the idea for this program. So, Richard, welcome, and tell us a little bit about your inspiration for this and the important message that you want to give.
I was inspired to deal with the issues of race because in what I've seen in the news media, what I've seen nationally, is that questions of race and ethnicity and sexuality all seem to create divisiveness rather than understanding. And many times I believe that we operate from a position of fear rather than attempting to understand the perspective that other cultures and groups may have and try to come to some true understanding of how those people's hearts and minds really think.
So the topic for our program today is school integration, its history, its purpose, the results, as well as a look forward to how we can do better with our education system. And joining us for this discussion, we have Deborah Raing. She is the president of the Palm Beach County African Diaspora Historical and Cultural Society, as well as Brian Knowles, the manager of the Palm Beach County School District's Office of African American, Latino, and Gender Studies. So Deborah and Brian, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Richard, let's start by looking at the history behind school integration and what led up to it in the first place.
Well, as a lawyer, I look at the legal decisions that brought about desegregation. We go back to 1896, there's Plessy versus Ferguson, and that decision created the separate but equal, which essentially codified or put into law Jim Crow. It allowed for segregation in all public accommodations in schools so that there were essentially black schools and white schools ostensibly to be separate and equal, but the resources certainly were not the same in the black schools. We fast forward to 1954 with the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That decision, Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Justice, stated that it was time to integrate schools with all deliberate speed. And in Palm Beach County, that meant that they would fight an additional 21 years in order to integrate the schools, and not until 1971 were they fully integrated. And so it means a lot of things to a lot of people that we are finding ourselves today dealing with some of those issues that we dealt with back in 1954 all the way to 1971. And in order for us to bring a resolution to our past, we need to try to understand one another to make a better future for our children.
So how would you describe the situation in our public schools today?
Well, Brian would probably be the best person to give an account. But what I have learned from talking with him and reading news accounts is that currently black and brown children comprise 60% of the school students attending public school in Palm Beach County. Obviously, they do not make up 60% of the population. So we have a resegregating of schools occurring even today. And primarily it's because of housing patterns. We still live in greatly to a great extent in segregated communities, and the segregation and the separation of people creates a lack of understanding of cultures, a lack of understanding of intent and heart. And in order to overcome that, I think that programs like this, discussions like this, where we are freely talking about these subjects, are the way to a better future.
So why don't we have Brian chime in now? Brian, can you describe the situation in our public schools, what you think is different and why?
Absolutely. So in our current state, our school district is really putting forth some concerted efforts and it really increased the commitment to address some of the inequities that we're dealing with and some of the disparities that we're dealing within education. As we start that commitment and as we kind of work through that commitment process, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. So what really, and what Mr. Ryles said and mentioned is that yes, you're looking at what we usually call minorities, which is usually our Black and brown populations, which is our populations from the African diaspora and also our Latinx community. As usually we label those minorities, but within our public educational system, that's the majority of our students. But unfortunately, we're still seeing those particular subgroup of students lag as far as graduation rates, grade level reading proficiency in grades 3 and 10. We're still looking at disparities in suspension rates, even in placement in ESC or special education programs, and also limited access to accelerated courses based upon, just looking at just some of those racial demographics. Now, even though we just like you said back in 1954, between 1954 around the early 1970s, we saw integration take place here within Palm Beach County and throughout this country. But one of the things that a lot of our school districts and school systems and state governments failed to do is remediate the systems that weren't designed for those particular group of students. And we're looking at the implications of that even today. So one of the things that Mr. Rouse said that was extremely critical and pertinent is that we don't look back on these situations to create any guilt or just kind of stay within that time frame or some of those dark spots in our history, dark spots in our history, but so we can move forward to kind of find solutions to some of the issues that we're dealing with, because a lot of those issues are rooted in history.
I'm sure we want to bring Deborah into the conversation now as well. Deborah, what are your thoughts about this? We're talking about school segregation, then and now.
Okay, then and now, I went to a segregated high school. I went to a segregated elementary school. So from grades K through 12, I attended the segregated schools, starting out in Volusia County, but the majority here in Palm Beach County. And while they were segregated, I believe that our teachers and our parents made every effort to shield us from the ugliness of segregated schools. So whatever was lacking, we did not know, we were not made aware, other than the books that came in for a while from the white high schools. And so, like I said, whatever was lacking, our teachers were astute enough. They were so intelligent, were bright enough that they could fill in those voids and teach us with rigor and relevance, so that when we graduated from high school and went on to the college and university level, we knew that our education was far above par than some of the other students sitting in our mixed classrooms. The, um, the segregation, living in communities of isolation, you're not aware of what's on the other side, especially when you didn't interact with them. So we had the best. We had the best high school. We had the best faculty. We had the best of everything. And because we did not know what the other side looked like, because, we were not admitted to that side of the track, then of course, that's all we knew. We went off to competitions to compete with other Black high schools and brought back those top awards in not only academics, but also in music and other fields. And so looking at that from a segregated point of view, and then moving forward, when I returned home to teach in an integrated atmosphere, I noticed I noticed the differences, especially with the African American students not being placed in the advanced classes, with the African American teachers not teaching those courses, how lax they were in offering free days, and just not being as you know as positive about the African American children and pushing them forward, encouraging them to excel academically. So therefore, that fell on the African American faculty alone to push this effort for academic performance. And so I went on a quest to push first for Black teachers to teach the honors classes, and then to recruit those African American students to get in those classes. And then once I did that, the pushback that I learned was that then the students were told to go home and get a letter from their church minister, from their pastor, to give them permission. Now, if that wasn't absurd, and I just, it just lit a fuse in me. So I had to continue to fight. The struggle just continues. And so looking at it today, um, I had to still recruit students to get into the advanced placement. Um, while I was the advanced placement teacher later in later years, it still had to be a recruiting effort because students were made to feel like they were not good enough to be in those classes. They could not excel and participate. And all it took was some encouragement, just to let them know, hang with me. I'm not going to put you in this situation and cause you to fail. So yeah, we've come a ways, but there's so much more work to be done.
Yeah, my understanding, Richard, is that this is still happening. These discussions, what Deborah's talking about, these discussions are still happening today in 2021 about Black students not being encouraged, not being asked to be in those advanced classes, that they're looked over. I mean, is that what's still happening now, decades later?
I think that if we were to look at let's say, the integration with a long lens, it did not take into consideration the lack of knowledge that we as different races had of one another. And so many times the boogeyman is the unknown. The unknown creates fear. And so from both perspectives, I believe that the school district, the white teachers and white administrators had fear and had the boogeyman mentality in terms of not realizing or not appreciating the skill set that many of the students had coming into an integrated school system. And as a result, the expectations were low. Today, I think that the problem is much more complex because the African diaspora, meaning Black people from Haiti, from Jamaica, from the islands, from the Caribbean, all come with completely different perspectives on education and the need for education. Some are much more in tune with making sure that they succeed academically. So there are a host of issues that our school district is having to address as a result now of having people that are not indigenous Americans but are here maybe one or two generations. And so the problem that we had back when integration occurred in 1954 or 1971 here in Palm Beach County has now redoubled, because you have other ethnicities and other groups with completely different value systems and views of how education is supposed to operate.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that the intended results of integration, did they work?
Well, I've asked that question. I've asked that question of my children. I've asked that question of my grandchildren. I've asked that question of my peers. And on one level, they worked because we didn't have the stories I've heard about integration are the old books that I was talking with Miss Raing, and she was telling me about she would get a book that had 15 names in it, which would mean 15 school years had gone by with missing pages, and the teacher would have had to have copied a book that didn't have missing pages and provide them the copied pages in order for them to be able to get a complete study. We didn't have that anymore. But the issues of low expectations, I was the very first Black student to attend South Olive Elementary School. And fortunately for me, my mother was one of the first Black teachers to teach at that school. They tried to track me into special education classes because they couldn't understand that I was probably intellectually ahead of my grade, but I liked to play around. I didn't like to study, like a lot of children. But it was seen as a low intelligence versus being someone who is has a high
Active,
intellect.
yeah.
And had it not been for my mother, they had put me in a class where I was walking on a balance beam, and we were outside doing balance exercises like hopscotch. And certainly as a first grade student, I would have preferred to remain in that class rather than in the class where I was learning something. Mm-hmm. And my mother happened to look out the window and see me out there, and she went to the principal and said, "Why is he out there?" And she said, "Well, he's just not on grade level." And she says, he reads above grade level. What are you doing? And when they tested me, they found that out. Now, had I not had a mother who was actually at the school witnessing what was happening, I most likely would never have become an attorney.
Yeah,
Because I couldn't have caught up.
And most people don't have mom there watching out for us,
Exactly.
in school. Brian, let me have you jump into this conversation. We all kind of, I think, understand what integration was supposed to do, the intended results. How do you think we did?
There are pros and cons to it. It did create some access, but sometimes it goes beyond just establishing and creating the access for us. Integration did have some adverse impacts on African American children and also African American communities as well. Integration was one of those destabilizing components of our communities. In addition to, there was a lot of capacity building that should have took place with the integration of schools, just like Mr. Ryles mentioned, is building capacity with educators around the history and culture of some of those incoming students, of those Black students that were coming in. In addition to, one of the things that this office that I represent does throughout our school district, and it's been within our school district for over 27 years, but actually Mrs. Raing is actually the first manager of my current position. And what we do is develop culturally responsive curriculum and teaching and instructional materials. But you integrate Black children into a school system that does not have they're not represented within a curriculum. They don't have the opportunity to see themselves in a positive light. The history of people of the African diaspora is completely either marginalized, omitted, or written within just the margins of just the core curriculum within our school. So we have to understand what kind of psychological impact that have on Black students, where they don't have the opportunity to see themselves. They don't feel like they fit in. You've had a lot of science and a lot of history that have made a concerted effort to make sure that we dehumanize Black children. Then I'm sitting in a classroom where this is being constantly indoctrinated, or something that's being constantly taught to me in a manner where I don't exist within that. So I would say that the school district or the school system itself did not do a very good job of addressing some of those issues before they integrated, or even during the integration process. And I think the result of that is a huge disconnect for Black children of their history, of their culture, and their experiences, and also even a disengagement and disconnect of the elders and even within their communities. So, we have a job to do moving forward. Is there work that's been done? Yes, absolutely. There's been a lot of work that's been done, especially over the past 27 years with the existence of my department. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to curriculum and providing these students with an opportunity, first of all, to see themselves in a positive way. And most importantly, that educator that's sitting right there is responsible for the complete life trajectory of this child, to see this child in a positive light, so they can to provide that social and emotional support for that child.
Deborah, do you want to jump in on this? Some thoughts about what Brian just brought up?
Right. We have so many instances where the entire child is not being educated, and also where they don't see themselves in the curriculum and in what's being taught. And so therefore there tends to be a move for the students to become disinterested, or just to sit there and not participate. And so I know with Brian's office, and what we've tried to do was to infuse and transform that curriculum so that students feel like they're a part of. But also, as we looked at, as Attorney Ryles mentioned, so many different cultures and ethnicities are now a part of the school system. I think it should have been an effort on the school district to see what can I do to um, to bring these children into the school system and provide them the access, not just say, oh, you have access, but provide it and ensure that they get in it, that they are successful. So often, um, inappropriate comments are made about other cultures. And of course, there's a need for professional development because sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's just a lack of knowledge. But definitely, when teachers take the time to look at their classroom and say, okay, so I've got X number of students from these different lands, it doesn't take a lot to mention a couple of facts from that child's history and that child's country, and you can see them light up and they start to participate. So our children, like Attorney Ryles said, if his mom had not been there, they need advocates on every aspect of the curriculum, somebody who's going to be there to look out for them. And I still do that even though I'm not retired. If they call me and say, I need help selecting these classes, I'm not getting the help I need. I'm in this class and I just don't feel like I'm getting it. And I can either direct them somewhere or either I can help them. But so much of this system is built on what used to be. We've expanded it a little bit to buy some different kinds of textbooks. And sometimes those textbooks have had some questionable pictures or the language is just not appropriate. But we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go so that we can improve the academic performance and the academic excellence of all students. And if the Black students improve, if the Black students excel, if the Black students are included, the brown students included, then all students will benefit from that. So once we fix, but we've got to be open to do what you're doing today, having this open discussion. And we got to be willing to hear and to listen, not to point fingers and say, oh, you did this and you did that. We have truly got to be ready to sit at that table and be accepting of what's pointed out and then come up with those strategies. It cannot continue to be us and them, but being us. And I think from going back to slavery, just that the African American person was never regarded as a whole human being or somebody who I needed to give an equal part of the pie as I gave to the other person. There's always been in equity. And so we need to look at if I give all of my students the equal amount and provide them with that equity, which means all of those strategies, all of the provisions so that they can reach that same level at the same time, then, I've answered that question. I provided that opportunity, and therefore they won't go lacking.
Well, Brian, were you going to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to add to what Mrs. Range did mention, and about that. So much effort has been done throughout history. You look at the institution of slavery, which is one of the darkest periods in American history that we should all have that conversation about. But there was so much effort that was put in to dehumanizing Black people of African descent to justify that institution. But that's why it's critically important that we make sure that we correct history, that we bring a positive and a more accurate representation of history, looking at the historical contributions of Black people in our schools, not for the purpose of just a recollection of facts and dates and here's the first Black person to do such and such. But the purpose of that is to create a counter narrative around that whole concept of dehumanization, right? So when we talk about the school system itself as being something that has done a disservice to Black students, we have to look at the converse side of that as well. Listening to some of the comments and some of the, especially in our current climate around this individual acts of bigotry, not racism. Racism is not an individual act. Racism is a systemic issue, right? So when we talk about individual acts of racism, which we should be called bigotry, and even some of the issues that we deal with some of our kids in the classroom right now, and some of their things that they're saying, we have an educational system that's not doing right by white kids either. If we have an educational system that is not talking about full historical accuracy, that we're not providing all students the opportunity to learn about each other's history and historical contributions that bring humanity to each and all of us, we're perpetuating a lot of ignorance, and we're perpetuating a lie. We're perpetuating a deficient educational system that has not only provided this service to our Black students, but for all students.
And when you ask the question, did integration, accomplish its goals? When Attorney Holland filed the lawsuit to desegregate the schools, it wasn't about putting his Black son next to the white child at Northborough Elementary. It was about equity. It was about getting the better resources. And so he knew if he put his child in this particular school, he would have those resources that were lacking at the other school. And so he was shrewd enough when he filed the lawsuit to not file it in his name, of course, but to file it in his son's name, because he was the subject of what had been done to him. And so the whole thing was about getting the resources, getting this equality. When Attorney Ryles mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson and the mandate for Jim Crow, of course, that went back even to the Dred Scott decision, where we were not looked at as whole equal people. But looking at that Jim Crow system, everything that was done, it was 3/4 of the pie would go over here, 1/4 of the pie would go here. And so as the lawsuit progressed, and it went on for almost 20 years after Brown v. Board here in Palm Beach County, because they were just, they just dug their heels in. They weren't going to do it. But Attorney Holland and Attorney Smith, along with Attorney Cunningham, they just continued to push for this to win the case. And it was just like the decision to pay the Black teachers less money. They had to file a lawsuit to get that. And it seems as though we need to look at this, that this country cannot continue to subsist as it started out in slavery on free labor. Now that slavery is over, we need to look at people have equal skills and they can provide equal services. So let's get on board with the democracy piece. And until we do that, until we decide, hey, what we're doing is just not equitable, it's just wrong, we aren't going to get past where we are. But I believe there's so many people of different cultures and races who are on this democracy board, and they say, okay, it's wrong, and I'm doing everything in my power to get it right, to serve all children, and to make sure that these inequities for African American and brown kids don't continue to exist.
As we said at the top of this show, the purpose of these roundtable discussions is to get perspective, and I think we're off to a really good start. So before we wrap it up, I do want to get some final thoughts from all three of you. And Brian, let's start with you. What are some final thoughts before we go?
My biggest thought is just to making sure that we can continue to have these conversations, right? These are difficult conversations that really present a lot of cognitive dissonance to a lot of people. And the purpose of these conversations is not to be divisive. The purpose of these conversations is not to perpetuate racism or any of those things. The purpose of these conversations is to look at the historical roots and the origins of some of the issues that we're dealing with. It's through education that we would be able to remediate some of this forms of thinking that creates the divisiveness. The whole purpose of this is to dismantle division amongst people by developing understanding of each other. It's okay to peacefully dissent with people, but we have to value each other's perspectives and based off our experiences and so forth. And it's through our educational system that we can address that by looking at our history, having those difficult, hard conversations, inside and outside of our classroom, within the educational system, and also within the community. So we thank you for this opportunity. And I'm just blessed to be here to continue some amazing work that has been put before me. Now, I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Mrs. Raing here. So thank you again.
Thank
Yeah, I
you.
appreciate being here today as well. I thank Attorney Ryles for asking me to be here. I look at this. I look at this presentation today as an opportunity uh, to open up the communication, but also to begin to build bridges, build bridges to listen to each other, and know that there are other perspectives out there, and that we can look at history and examine it, analyze it, and see how do we not go down that same path again. So I think as we continue these discussions and we look at the whole history of Palm Beach County with the educational piece, with the socioeconomic piece, that we can have the kind of conversations that will open the eyes of many and draw us closer together.
All right, Richard, we began with you. Let's end with you. Your final thoughts on our discussion today.
Well, Liz, I think that they have said it best. The Through the Black Lens is a program dedicated to building bridges of understanding and not walls of divisiveness. And we look forward to doing more of these because community conversations are how we become a better community, how we are able to live, work, and play in a place that is so beautiful and for all to enjoy.
All right. Well, that concludes our first episode of Through a Black Lens. I'd like to thank our guests once again, Deborah Raing, President of the Palm Beach County African Diaspora Historical and Cultural Society, as well as Brian Knowles, the manager of the Palm Beach County School District's Office of African, African American, Latino, and Gender Studies. For Richard Ryles, I'm Liz Quirantes. Thanks for watching.